Okay. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. So let me just quickly go over this. We're saying the objectives for this chapter are to implement batches. And by the word implement, I mean to be able to create batches, to be able to rename them, to alter them or modify them, to delete them. The second is you should be able to implement stored procedures. You should be able to create stored procedures. You should be able to modify stored procedures. You should be able to delete or drop stored procedures. Thirdly, you should be able to create functions, modify them, and delete them when they are no longer necessary. And we're saying that in SQL Server, as a database developer, you'll be writing code and applications, and it is going to be necessary at times to repeatedly execute certain SQL statements together. And in such cases, the best approach is to create a batch consisting of those statements that have to be executed together. So you can create multiple batches so that you are able to execute them as units whenever you need to perform certain tasks which have to be done repeatedly. Batches have the additional advantage in the sense that they're going to include programming constructs. I don't know if this word is familiar to any of you, the term programming constructs. A programming construct is simply a term that is used to describe the statements used in a programming language. Typically, most programming languages, they will execute statements in sequencing. So they will execute the first statement, then the next statement, then the third statement, and so on.
Yeah.
That's the normal way. But there are times when you need to include some logic in your program. For example, you're developing a website, a dynamic website for student registration. You can anticipate that at times when students want to register, it could be that they have already registered, but maybe they have forgotten their passwords. So they will attempt again to register. So a programming constraint can be included, which will first check if that student record exists in the database before creating or inserting a new record in the table. Now, to
Yes.
do that, you need to use batches. In the normal or the standard SQL statements, you cannot include logic statements or constructs, okay? But what we are looking at is the transact SQL language, okay?
Yes.
Another example is if you have a table containing sales agents, and you need to write a statement to calculate how much commission each sales agent has earned. You can expect that some sales agents might not have sold anything. So when retrieving the data from the table, SQL Server is going to come with a now value. And you don't want to attempt to perform a calculation using a now value. So you can include a statement, a logical statement in your batch to check if the value retrieved from the table is a now value, in which case you should skip the part where you have to perform the calculation. So the programming constraints will include those where you have to put the logic, where you'll be comparing to see whether one condition, whether a condition is true. Then there are also times when you need certain statements to be executed a certain number of times. Those are referred to as loops. So those are some of the constructs that you can have in a programming language. And we'll be looking at this as well in SQL, in the implementation of SQL, that is T-Transact SQL language. Batches that need to be executed repeatedly can be stored so that you can use them in future. You store them as stored procedures or functions. Batches primarily are temporal. You use them while you're executing codes. Once you close, then you lose them. But if you need to be able to make use of them, maybe you write some application which will be making use of those batches, you need to store them as stored procedures, or you create functions. And we'll be looking at that in this lesson. Here is an example I gave you of cases where you need to perform repeated SQL statements. The AdventureWorks database has split information about employees into multiple tables. So when you have a new employee joining, that information will need to be stored, inserted into more than one table. And that will require multiple statements to update that information. And so for such cases, you can create a batch. A batch is a logical unit. Okay, it's a logical unit. It's just a grouping together of statements, SQL statements, which you want to be executed together. Normally, it's because they are related to something. Maybe you have a database where you need to insert one record in one table before you can insert another record in another table. So because you have to follow that sequence of statements, those two are going to be treated like a unit. So you can make a batch. And this can make your database more efficient because it's going to reduce the network traffic in the way the statements are executed, compared to if you have to execute the individual statements repeatedly as individual statements. A batch is a group of SQL statements that is going to be submitted to the SQL server for execution as a unit. Before being executed, the statements are going to be compiled into a single executable plan, which we refer to as execution plan. And this is what makes it efficient when it comes to executing statements, because the process of compiling is not affected by the number of statements. But if you are doing the compilation for each statement, then you are going to waste more time. But if you put your statements together and execute them at one go, then you are going to reduce on the time that is spent on compiling the statement. Do we understand what is meant by the statement compilation or to compile?
To compile is to put together.
Okay. In the context of programming languages, we do have, okay, I'm looking at my time. Okay, so once we've finished the first 40 minutes, we just have to take a break, then we can continue. But in programming languages, we do have what is referred to as high-level language. That is the statements that you write, the commands that you write as a programmer, which will tell the computer what you want it to do. But the computer will not understand those words. Those words have to be translated into what is called machine language. Now, there are two approaches to that. The first approach is to take one statement and convert of high-level language, such as SQL statement or Java, take one statement at a time and convert it into machine language. That is interpreting. The second approach is to take the whole code, convert it into machine code in one go, and at the end of that, you create an executable file. And that is what is referred to as compilation. So programming languages are normally divided into interpreted languages and compiled languages. So compilation is just referring to converting the statements that you write of the program, which is high-level language or source code, into machine code, into what can be executed by the machine. Lastly, when you create a batch, you should always end with a keyword go. It's there to mark the end of a batch. Now, in batches, you can also take advantage of variables. A variable is a space in the computer's memory which can be used to store some information that is required during execution. And in most programming languages, to define a variable, you need to assign it a name, which a user-friendly name, and indicate the type of data that will be stored in that memory space. Some languages, such as PHP, JavaScript, are so simple, you do not need to indicate the data type. You just need to assign the name to the variable. But in SQL, we have to indicate both the name and the data type. And for SQL, we have to always make sure that all variables start with the @ symbol. That is user-defined variables. They have to start with a single @ symbol. The system variables, that is variables which are created by SQL Server for its own internal operations, have two variables. Sorry, they are going to start with two @ symbol like that. Okay. So when you see a variable with two @ symbols at the beginning, then you know that it's a system variable. But if it's you who is creating the variable, you only use one @ symbol, followed by the name that you want to assign to that variable. So to do that, to define a variable, you use the keyword declare. Declare followed by the variable name and then the data type. Quickly, let me just illustrate this. Suppose I want to perform calculations like commission. I can declare a variable which I can call commission, and the data type for this will be maybe numeric 5,2, and then I can assign the value to it by saying maybe 1,000 times 0.25. Okay. So I'm creating a variable called commission, and